Okay, let's unpack this deep dive on how populist governments handle the world stage. We hear the rhetoric constantly. The promise of putting the nation first, condemning globalists, demanding sovereignty. But what actually happens?
That's the core question, isn't it?
I mean, what happens to a country's established foreign policy when a populist leader actually takes the reins? Does all that talk, translate into actual policy?
It's the ultimate question we're addressing today, and the findings are, well, they're far more nuanced than just saying populists withdraw from the world.
What?
Our mission here is to really analyze how and why these governments fundamentally change or, in some really surprising cases, maintain their country's foreign policy compared to their non-populist predecessors.
And the sources we're relying on for this, they give us a truly global picture. We're drawing analysis from research specifically compiled for the book Populism and Foreign Policy.
Exactly, and that gives us a comparative look at 7 pretty diverse cases. We're moving beyond just the usual suspects.
So not just Europe or the U.S.
Yeah, not at all. We have 4 key cases from the global south. That's Bolivia, India, the Philippines, and Turkey. And we're comparing those with 3 major European examples: Hungary, the UK, and Italy.
And how are we breaking that down?
We'll be analyzing their behavior across 3 crucial domains: international disputes, the provision of global public goods, and finally, the reorientation of international partnerships.
That's a robust framework. But, before we dive into the actions, we need to nail down the actor. Populism itself. It's defined in these sources as a thin-centered ideology.
It is.
That phrasing, it sounds almost contradictory, like saying structure without substance. Can you unpack what that means? Why is that definition so critical here?
It's the essential starting point. I mean, when we talk about communism or liberalism, those are what we call thick ideologies.
Right. They have a whole worldview baked in.
Yeah.
Economics, social structure, the works.
Precisely. They offer a complete, comprehensive vision for how society should be structured. Populism, by contrast, is thin-centered because it's primarily a political strategy and a worldview, not a policy blueprint.
So it doesn't have the answers on its own.
It doesn't. It has to borrow a thick ideology like socialism or maybe nationalism or even religious fundamentalism to give it that policy substance.
So the populism provides the political style and the driver, and then the thick ideology provides the specific direction, like an anti-immigrant policy or economic redistribution.
You've got it. And regardless of whether the populist leader is left-wing or right-wing, that populist core structure, it always features 2 indispensable elements. And these create the engine for foreign policy change.
Let's start with the first one then, anti-elitism.
This is the condemnation of the political establishment, the perceived, corrupt, impure elite. This elite is often defined as having betrayed the nation, maybe they've succumbed to foreign interests, or they're just completely out of touch.
And we see powerful examples of this, right? The sources point to Narendra Modi in India.
They do. His early rhetoric was masterful in using these historical and religious analogies to frame the political opposition as the enemy elite.
The sources highlight how he, coming from outside that traditional Delhi political world, used this incredibly potent language to define his opposition. What specific examples does the research point to?
Well, for example, he explicitly referred to the Congress Party, which, governed India for most of its post-independence history. He called them the Delhi Sultanate.
Wow. Okay, that's not just standard political opposition. The Delhi Sultanate refers to centuries of historical rule by foreign non-Hindu dynasties.
Exactly.
So by using that term, he instantly links the modern opposition with an antagonistic, historical, and sort of foreign-aligned force. It leverages his Hindu nationalist thick ideology immediately.
It's an incredibly effective tool for mobilization, and he doesn't stop once he's in office. He has consistently styled himself as the ultimate outsider, the son of a tea seller, contrasting himself with these entrenched elites.
He famously mocked Rahul Gandhi as, was it Namdar?
Yes, Namdar, meaning dynastic or aristocratic. It's a direct attack on the Congress Party's dynastic character. This is fundamental. Populism requires this clear distinction between the pure people and the impure elite.
Which leads us directly to the second element, people-centrism. The leader doesn't just claim to represent the people, they claim to be the singular, moral, true people.
That's the rhetorical core. The leader claims ownership of the popular will. They assert that their voice isn't just one among many, but it's the authentic, collective, and only legitimate voice of the nation.
There's a quote in the source material from one of Modi's speeches that really captures this.
Yes. From an Independence Day speech, he's quoted saying, "I am merely an instrument. It is not one single person who makes that address, but it is the collective voice of 1.25 billion of my countrymen that resounds from the Red Fort. I try to give words to their dreams.
That elevates him from a politician to a conduit for the national spirit.
It does. And when you, the listener, look at that kind of rhetoric, you realize it places the leader not just above the elite, but as the literal spiritual embodiment of the public's singular will.
And when you project that mindset onto the global stage, you inevitably get what the sources call a Manichaean worldview in international relations.
That black and white zero-sum perspective. If I'm the pure embodiment of the nation, then anyone who opposes my interests domestically or internationally, well, they must be part of that corrupt, impure elite or its foreign, treacherous allies.
It moves foreign policy out of that traditional realm of messy, gray area negotiations and compromise.
And into the realm of moral conflict where there are only winners and losers. It's a critical psychological shift. And the analysis pinpoints two key levers, two driving forces that populist regimes use to turn this worldview into tangible foreign policy change.
And those are personalization and mobilization.
Exactly.
Let's dedicate some time to those two drivers because they really explain how that policy continuity breaks down, starting with personalization.
This is the concentration of decision-making power directly around the leader, often by actively sidelining the established professional foreign policy bureaucracies.
And that sidelining is deliberate, isn't it?
It's very deliberate.
Yeah.
These bureaucracies, the foreign ministry, the diplomatic corps, they're often seen by the populist leader as part of that elite that betrayed the national interest. Maybe they're too cozy with global institutions or prior political rivals.
So in India, for example, we see the Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA. It's increasingly focused just on soft power and diaspora issues under Modi.
With less salient roles in core security or geopolitical relationships, the big decisions are pulled into the leader's office.
And the risk here is that when decision-making is so concentrated, it becomes entirely dependent on the individual leader's priorities, their preferences, and critically, their personality.
The personality is paramount. We have a really powerful anecdote illustrating this chilling effect under Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines.
His foreign policy was notoriously erratic. What exactly happened in those high-level meetings?
Well, the sources quote a senior diplomat describing how the National Security Council meetings devolved into this careful exercise in bureaucratic self-preservation.
So they were trying to manage him.
They were actively trying to manage his personality. The exact quote was, secretaries were actually avoiding the chances of Duterte talking about certain things, because for them, if Duterte said something on record, then they would have difficulty in backing out.
Wow.
So they would present something to him and then immediately divert his attention.
Think about the implication of that for a moment. The policy process is not about synthesizing intelligence and defeating strategic options. It's about the bureaucracy actively trying to steer the leader away from making rash, irreversible policy commitments based purely on impulse.
The bureaucracy is fighting to survive the day-to-day personality of the president. That's the chilling effect of extreme personalization.
It means that issues the leader takes a personal interest in, often based on grudges or perceived slights, see massive shifts in issues they don't care about.
Which the bureaucracy manages quietly, see continuity. This makes the populist state a highly unpredictable and, frankly, a risky partner. A partnership founded on shared goals can just evaporate overnight if the leader feels personally slighted.
Absolutely. And the flip side of this driver is mobilization. This is using foreign policy issues, whether they're real disputes or invented crises, to rally and sustain domestic support.
This is where that anti-elitism becomes internationalized. Populists use foreign policy to frame their domestic opposition as being linked to foreign enemies,
reinforcing that division between the pure people and the treacherous elite.
We see this perfectly with Turkey's Erdogan, especially after key turning points like the 2013 Gezi protests and the attempted coup later on.
That was the point where he started claiming that obscure international forces were plotting against Turkey, wasn't it?
Yes, he elevated the concept of the corrupt domestic elite to the international level. He introduced the idea of the mastermind, Ustakal.
The mastermind.
This allegedly comprised Western imperialists, global interest lobbies, and crusaders, all trying to divide and conquer Turkey.
By inventing this obscure international mastermind, he instantly achieves two goals. He legitimizes his own domestic crackdown as a necessary defense, and he frames any political opposition at home as serving this foreign agenda.
It's a perfect feedback loop. A retired Turkish diplomat noted that this extensive use of foreign policy as an integral part of domestic politics really only became pronounced after 2011.
Which aligns directly with Erdogan's increasingly personalized and populist phase.
Exactly. So these two drivers, extreme personalization and constant domestically focused mobilization, they really set the stage for our first deep dive, international disputes.
So let's move to that first domain, populism and the escalation of international disputes. Given that Manichaean worldview we just discussed, seeing the world in black and white, the logical assumption is that a populist leader will naturally seek conflict over conciliation.
That expectation largely holds true, especially in cases where the drivers are strong and the constraints are few. Look at India and Pakistan under Modi since 2014. The approach became, well, dramatically more conflictive compared to the UPA governments led by Manmohan Singh.
And this shift is significant because it actively broke with previous long-term efforts toward rapprochement.
Right.
I mean, even the previous Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Vajpayee, he pushed for the composite dialogue to improve ties.
That's right. The diplomatic infrastructure for dialogue existed. But under Modi, that diplomatic track was largely abandoned in favor of a personalized, security-focused approach.
The Ministry of External Affairs was sidelined on the most sensitive files.
It was. And the crucial difference was the abandonment of institutional consensus building. Manmohan Singh used to seek bipartisan consensus on delicate foreign policy. He'd consult senior BJP opposition leaders like Sushma Swaraj or L.K. Advani.
So there was a degree of national unity, a measured policy. That institutional safeguard was removed.
It was replaced by a highly centralized system. Modi managed relations personally, almost exclusively with his national security advisor, Ajit Doval.
And that personalization, paradoxically, created immense domestic pressure on Modi himself.
Immense pressure. The moment there was a terrorist attack, like the one in Uri in September 2016, Modi was suddenly facing a clamor at home. Having personalized the process and built his persona on strength, he felt compelled to act decisively.
And he opted to escalate.
He did. So the personalization not only sped up decision-making, but also made those decisions riskier, because the leader had to satisfy the domestic mobilization machine he himself had created. It's a self-imposed pressure cooker leading to confrontation.
We see a mirror image of this dynamic in the dispute between Turkey and Greece, which worsened considerably after Erdogan's populist turn around 2011.
Right. Turkey had previously pursued this zero problems with neighbors doctrine, a classic diplomatic approach.
What did Erdogan do to dismantle that?
That doctrine was replaced by a continuous securization of disputes, all driven by mobilization. Relations moved from a peaceful phase to one where military confrontation was openly threatened.
And this came to a head with a naval collision in the Aegean in August 2020 over gas exploration rights.
It did, bringing two NATO allies perilously close to military escalation.
Was this purely about territorial rights, or was there a domestic mobilization angle to it?
Oh, it was deeply tied to mobilization. Observers largely agreed that the high-tension standoff was used by Erdogan as a classic diversionary tactic. He needed to deflect severe domestic attention away from Turkey's military predicaments in places like Syria and Libya. Not to mention the economic decline at home. He needed a strong foreign enemy.
And he used these mobilization tactics related to the Greek border that were profoundly cynical, using human suffering for political gain.
Yes. In early 2020, Turkey bused thousands of refugees and migrants to the Turkish-Greek border and actively encouraged them to cross.
And when reports surfaced of Greek officials using force for pushbacks,
the AKP government immediately seized on it. They framed Greece's actions as evidence of the hypocrisy and moral decline of the West, portraying Turkey as the moral humanitarian actor.
So in both the India-Pakistan and the Turkey-Greece disputes, strong personalization combined with the need for domestic mobilization resulted in a clearly more conflictive foreign policy.
It did, justifying that initial expectation. However, and this is a major caveat, the research shows that this drive for conflict is not an iron rule. There are factors that can enforce moderation.
The moderation due to contextual constraints.
Specifically, vulnerability. The case of India and China is the perfect illustration.
Right. India and China share serious border issues, and while the dynamic is certainly tense, Modi's policy toward China was only somewhat more confrontational, not radically escalatory like with Pakistan. So why the difference?
This is linked directly to India's overwhelming vulnerability vis-a-vis China's superior military and economic power. Indian leaders, despite their populist rhetoric, had to be acutely aware of the existential risk of a major military confrontation.
So even a populist leader decided that the domestic benefit of mobilization was not worth the strategic risk.
Exactly. While public anger flared up domestically after border clashes in 2020, you had calls for boycotts of Chinese goods. The government deliberately restrained the domestic mobilization.
You have this stunning example of Modi avoiding any mention of China whatsoever in his 2020 Independence Day speech, even amidst fierce domestic debates over the border.
They effectively told the domestic audience to quiet down. An Indian observer summed up that constraint with a phrase that really sticks with you.
What was that?
The observer noted that whipping up the nationalism card hasn't been whipped up. It's too dangerous. While you're riding a tiger, you cannot jump off.
That's powerful. It proves that even populist strongmen, if they're facing a superior adversary, will subordinate mobilization to sheer strategic prudence.
That distinction is crucial. Escalation against a weaker rival versus restraint against a superior one.
Now let's look at the Philippines and the U.S. alliance, a case defined by a highly personalized, inconsistent conflict. Duterte's anti-Americanism was constant, but the policy never really followed the rhetoric.
His anti-Americanism, it really appeared to be a personal sentiment, deeply rooted in his provincial experiences as a local statesman in Mindanao.
And it was exacerbated by incidents he perceived as deeply personal offenses, right?
Yes, the reports detail how, early in the 2000s, he felt rudely treated by a U.S. immigration officer. And then, more significantly, when President Obama criticized his brutal war on drugs and refused to shake his hand at a meeting, Duterte felt so insulted.
That sounds almost petty, but when the personal offense dictates foreign policy, it becomes a national issue.
It does, and this personal offense translated immediately into symbolic public criticism and a shift to a somewhat more confrontational stance. But here's the paradox. The policy itself remained deeply ambivalent.
Why was that?
Duterte was reluctant to completely overturn decades of deep cooperation because the military and foreign policy establishments knew that the alliance was strategically vital.
So while Duterte made loud noises about pivoting to China and shunning Washington, the deep military relationship just continued underneath.
Absolutely. The bureaucracy managed to keep the policy wheels turning. The biggest bellicaton, the major U.S.-Philippines military exercise, actually happened under Duterte's watch. The policy shift was mostly symbolic and short-lived.
And he only returned to the U.S. alliance more fully when his attempt at rapprochement with China failed to deliver the promised economic gains.
Exactly. Transactional populism only works when the transactions actually deliver.
That brings us to our second major domain, populism and the provision of global public goods, or GPGs. The common expectation is that populists should be isolationist or, fundamentally egoistic.
That is the logical assumption. I mean, it's rooted in slogans like America First.
Right. Why would a leader who puts their people first spend resources on something non-excludable that benefits the other out there, whether that's climate mitigation or faraway peacekeeping?
Especially since global public goods benefit everyone regardless of who pays. Think about a global health initiative or stabilizing a distant conflict. The benefits flow across borders, leading to classic free-riding problems. Populists should reject paying those costs.
But the research here provides a genuinely surprising finding.
It does. The 4 Global South cases that were in power for a considerable time, India, Turkey, Bolivia, and the Philippines, they did not contest the necessity of global governance or vilify GPGs for domestic mobilization. They didn't say, the UN is corrupt, we must leave.
Instead, in several cases, strong personalization and mobilization led to an increased readiness to provide selected global public goods. Why?
This is driven primarily by status seeking. For aspiring middle powers or great powers, contribution to GPG is a tool to elevate national status and enhance the leader's personal image on the global stage.
Let's start with Turkey. We see increased engagement in both peace and aid under Erdogan. How does that translate to status seeking?
Turkey's engagement in mediation increased dramatically, often through highly personalized efforts by Erdogan. He constantly positions himself in global conflict resolution, like offering mediation in the Russia-Ukraine war.
So he uses these efforts to elevate Turkey's status as a necessary global player.
And he consistently broadcasts his involvement to domestic audiences. It's excellent material for mobilization that says, your leader is powerful on the world stage.
And the financial commitments back this up. The official development assistance budget rose sharply during his populist phase.
The numbers are stark. He explicitly adopted the notion of being a humanitarian power. He personally appeared in dozens of aid activities, often visiting African countries, which substantially increased the domestic visibility of these efforts.
One could argue this is still a form of egoism,
Yeah.
stood up globally. If the sole motivation is domestic status, is this genuine cooperation or just strategic branding?
That's the critical question. And the analysis suggests it's not altruism, it's high-level strategic branding. The populist leader is saying, I am contributing to this global good, but I'm doing it for you, the people, because it makes our nation great.
Which means they will only contribute to GPGs that provide maximum visible status.
Exactly. We see a similar status-driven dynamic with India and climate policy. Modi increased India's readiness to engage in climate mitigation.
He was a strong voice for climate justice, the principle that advanced countries must leave room for developing countries to grow.
He was. But the shift in India's willingness to act was also partially driven by status competition with regional rivals. When China declared its emissions would peak by 2030, Modi reacted by demonstrating a similar willingness to act, launching significant solar and green energy initiatives.
So, contributing to the global public good of climate action became a tool for national status enhancement, a way of competing on the world stage.
It became an opportunity, not a burden. This is a profound shift from the predicted isolationist response. But status seeking isn't the only driver. We also see cases defined by the appearance reality gap in GPG.
Where mobilization is external and domestic policy remains unchanged. Bolivia under Evo Morales is a classic example regarding climate change.
Yes, his government used extremely strong activist rhetoric on the international stage. They strongly criticized multilateral negotiations as insufficient and pushed a people's diplomacy rhetoric.
He was famous for his speeches at the UN against imperial warmongering and capitalism.
But the sources noted a profound disconnect once you looked at domestic policy. That's the appearance reality gap. Domestically, Bolivia continued extractive policies, including extensive deforestation.
So the performance was for the international stage, but the national reality was different.
Because the leader didn't invest personal capital in the domestic change. Crucially, Morales himself did not personalize climate policy. It was driven by specific activist diplomats. Since climate change wasn't a consistent personal concern for Morales that could secure immediate domestic votes, the radical rhetoric remained largely external.
That makes sense. Another example is India's approach to UN peacekeeping. We observed overall continuity under Modi, even though contributions declined slightly.
The fundamental commitment hadn't vanished.
So, if the policy didn't change radically, where did the populist imprint show up?
In the specific mobilization efforts around the UN, Modi personalized India's role in the UN not by changing the policy, but for building national pride. He repeatedly referenced India's peacekeeping contributions in his monthly Mann Ki Baat radio addresses.
He personalizes the celebration of the contribution, even if he didn't initiate the contribution itself.
Exactly. He also enthusiastically celebrated International Yoga Day globally, framing India's culture as a global public good for domestic applause.
But the sources also mention his surprising lack of involvement in high-stakes mediation.
That's a key detail. Despite India being a highly sought-after mediator, particularly after the Russia-Ukraine invasion, Modi's personal involvement in structured conflict resolution remained surprisingly low.
He visited Moscow and Kyiv, but there was no sustained follow-up.
And when the Swiss Peace Summit was held in 2024, despite continuous Western calls for stronger Indian involvement, Modi only sent a mid-ranking diplomat.
This reinforces that core finding. Policy continuity prevails unless the issue is highly salient, highly personalized by the leader, or can be used immediately for status competition or domestic mobilization.
When the drivers are weak, as in the low personalization of complex, difficult conflict mediation, the policy largely continues as before.
That brings us to our third domain, populism and the reorientation of international partnerships. If populist leaders are attacking external elites, whether it's Brussels or the U.S., who do they turn to for alliances?
We see a variety of responses here, from radical ideological alignment to highly pragmatic multi-alignment. Bolivia, under Evo Morales, provides the cleanest textbook case of a radical shift to ideological alignment.
This was a complete, rapid reorientation away from the U.S. sphere of influence.
Instantly. Morales expelled the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, and the Law Enforcement Affairs Office. He rapidly pivoted toward ideologically aligned countries, particularly Venezuela and Cuba.
This was the MAS socialistic ideology impacting foreign affairs, defining the U.S. as the foreign enemy elite.
It was. And this ideological proximity was backed by very tangible, practical diplomatic support, not just rhetoric. Morales was an enthusiastic supporter of ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America.
A regional body that provided funding and specific projects.
Yes, including establishing the anti-imperialist school for soldiers from aligned countries like Venezuela and Nicaragua, explicitly counteracting decades of prior military training received at the U.S.-based School of the Americas.
That's a dramatic reversal of national security culture.
It is. The sources also detail the sheer personal proximity this created. Venezuela's ambassador often traveled with Morales on domestic and foreign trips using an airplane and helicopter provided by the state-owned PDVSA.
So the partners literally share vehicles.
That's highly personalized, practical diplomatic support rooted in ideological affinity.
Contrast that radical shifts with Turkey under Erdogan, which demonstrated a radical shift toward new spheres of influence by substantially distancing itself from Western partners.
Erdogan's major turn away from the West intensified after two public, high-profile events. The 2009 Davos crisis, where he stormed out of a panel debate with Israel's Shimon Peres. And then, more crucially, the 2013 Gezi Park protests and the 2016 coup attempt.
Why did those events solidify the break?
In his eyes, the West had abandoned him. They were either unwilling or too slow to support him fully during those crises. This led to the escalation of attacks on Western imperialists and the broader rhetoric of the Usta call.
So the West transitioned from being a potential partner for EU accession to becoming the defining enemy elite in his mobilization strategy.
Correct. This necessitated a pursuit of new partnerships, notably deepening ties with Russia, despite their history of friction, and significantly increasing Turkey's presence in Africa.
And the messaging here was designed to appeal to the global South.
Exactly. Erdogan emphasized a win-win and equal partnership, explicitly adopting a non-colonial perspective to contrast with the historical actions of Western powers. He was offering an alternative sphere of influence.
Now we come to India, where the approach is defined not by radical alignment or abandonment, but by strategic multi-alignment. This sounds like a sophisticated balancing act.
It is perhaps the most sophisticated case study. Under Modi, India shifted decisively from the decades-long rhetoric of non-alignment to what they call multi-alignment.
But the fundamental goal remained the same, ensuring India was not dependent on a single partner.
But the pursuit of this goal became much more energetic and pragmatic. And they achieved a remarkable feat, deepening security partnerships with the West, the U.S., and France, while simultaneously refusing to condemn Russia over the Ukraine invasion.
How did they pull off this balancing act?
By using personalization and strategic necessity to their maximum advantage. The sources note the deep personal affinity between Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron, which has facilitated major arms deals.
And regarding Russia, they used the West's need for India's partnership to justify their own strategic autonomy.
Precisely. Modi's government explicitly used this peculiar situation where the West was aggressively courting India as a counterweight to China. This allowed India to maintain its strategic autonomy, even refusing to take a side against Russia, and securing access to crucial defense equipment and heavily discounted Russian oil.
It's a perfect illustration of how populism, married to great power ambition, can be highly effective in transactional foreign policy.
They maximized their self-interest by becoming indispensable to multiple, sometimes opposed, partners, and they diversified far beyond the traditional heavyweights.
Broadening partnerships across the Middle East with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and even Iran.
And, crucially, emphasizing India's role in the Global South, hosting the virtual Voice of the Global South Summit, and successfully inviting the African Union to join the G20. This was all heavily personalized by Modi as proof of India's leadership status.
Finally, we have the Philippines under Duterte, a case of a limited shift. He certainly tried to pivot away from the U.S. toward China. Why did that shift ultimately fail?
Duterte made visible efforts at rapprochement, downplaying the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling that was favorable to the Philippines and employing friendly rhetoric. This move was initially pragmatic, as it aligned closer to the Asian consensus.
But the personal approach didn't yield the hoped-for results.
No. Duterte hoped for huge economic gains from China, but they failed to materialize. Adding insult to injury, Chinese gray zone operations, harassment of fishing vessels, and military patrols continued.
So it showed that transactional populism only holds when the transactions deliver.
Exactly. Ultimately, the Philippines reverted toward Washington, demonstrating the limits of a purely personalized pivot when strategic and economic realities don't align with the leader's wishes.
Now we shift gears completely and look at the European cases, Hungary, the UK, and Italy, to see if the dynamics of personalization and mobilization play out differently within the established Western democratic institutions and the structure of the EU.
This comparison is essential because the EU places strong legal and institutional constraints on sovereignty, constraints that the populist leaders immediately target. Hungary under Viktor Orban is our first case, the quintessential European populist.
Orban's anti-elite focus has been dynamic. It started domestically, but then pivoted hard to an external enemy, Brussels.
That pivot was crucial for his survival and mobilization. The enemy elite shifted from corrupt domestic figures to Brussels and European bureaucrats, often described as far-detached technocrats aiming to undermine Hungarian sovereignty and culture, particularly through migration policy.
And this was skillfully conflated with other targets, like liberal NGOs and George Soros.
Who was frequently portrayed on campaign posters as conspiring with the EU elite. By framing the EU as the external enemy, he turned every policy disagreement into a defense of Hungarian sovereignty.
Making every domestic political fight a foreign policy battle.
It's a powerful mobilizing tool. And Orban didn't just target the EU, he built an active international network of allies, what the sources call the pan-populist overtures. Budapest has become a meeting ground for the populist right.
He hosts CPAC Hungary, which is a significant signal, and he's actively building alliances within the EU structure itself.
Yes. In 2024, his Fidesz party announced the formation of a new grouping in the European Parliament called Patriots for Europe, uniting groups like France's Rassemblement National and Italy's Lega.
But perhaps the most radical foreign policy shift is the Russia rapprochement. That's a profound turn given Hungary's historical experience.
It is a radical turn rooted in Orban's personal agenda, possibly stemming from a significant visit to the Kremlin in 2009. Relations became pragmatic, transactional, and insulated from EU consensus.
And he justifies this by framing appeasement in peace-promoting terms.
Exactly.
Yeah.
His approach during the Ukraine conflict has been to frame appeasement in terms of stopping the war, positioning himself as a necessary neutral force against the perceived Western war machine.
And when it comes to global public goods, Orban is described as a climate obstructionist. This is where he fits that initial theoretical expectation of populist egoism much better than Turkey or India.
He perfectly embodies the isolationist prediction in this area. He consistently casts doubt on climate mitigation, framing the costs as burdens imposed by Brussels bureaucrats. His government took concrete steps to weaken mitigation, eliminating the independent Ministry of the Environment.
So on GPGs, if the cost is immediate and the status gain is low, he obstructs and mobilizes against the cost imposer.
And his approach to aid mirrors his thick ideology. Development aid was significantly reduced and refocused exclusively on issues aligning with his ideology. Combating migration and assisting persecuted Christians abroad, issues that are perfect for domestic mobilization.
Let's move across the continent to the UK under Boris Johnson, who successfully mobilized domestic support around the issue of sovereignty and getting Brexit done.
Johnson's populist identity was inextricably linked to Brexit. Foreign policy dominated his tenure and was characterized by profound, strong personalization. The sources highlight the institutional erosion, noting the decline of the National Security Council.
We saw in the Philippines how that sidelining of institutions creates a chilling effect.
Yeah.
How did the UK case demonstrate this?
Johnson showed remarkable disdain for bureaucratic processes. His appointment of David Frost, a political operative with no defense background, as National Security Advisor broke with decades of precedent. The Foreign Office was marginalized.
This executive centralization fueled a highly confrontational EU dispute.
The negotiation focus was entirely on achieving a purist view of sovereignty, often explicitly at the cost of immediate economic harm. The political imperative overrode the economic reality.
Yet we see a stunning contradiction in GPG, the surprising climate U-turn. Johnson was a past climate skeptic, yet he became an active proponent of mitigation once in office.
This is a unique instance where extreme personalization reinforced GPG efforts. Despite his past skepticism, he launched the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution and energetically hosted COP26.
And this policy shift was rooted not in institutional consensus or party ideology, but in a single high-level scientific briefing he received in 2019.
Which fundamentally changed his personal opinion.
This highlights the immense institutional vulnerability created by personalization, doesn't it? National policy pivots entirely on the single, unpredictable whim of the personalized leader.
Exactly. The fact that the UK went from skepticism to leadership on climate change because of a single briefing received by one man illustrates both the power and the danger of this model.
The Johnson era was also defined by the global Britain agenda. How did this agenda reconcile his defense of the liberal international order with his anti-elite domestic politics?
The agenda was full of contradictions. The UK sought revigorated ties with traditional Western partners, the US, Australia, Japan. Yet simultaneously, Johnson was openly prepared to break international law over issues central to his thick ideology, like the Northern Ireland Protocol or the Rwanda deportation plan.
So they rhetorically defended the global order while actively undermining its legal foundations for immediate domestic political gain.
It is the ultimate expression of the populist worldview. They will use international structures when they provide status or security, but they will never allow those structures to constrain their ability to deliver on core domestic promises.
Finally, we examine Italy's short-lived Yellow-Green coalition, which lasted from 2018 to 2019. This demonstrates the chaos created by dual personalization and competition.
This government saw two competing personalized foreign policies, reflecting the respective thick ideologies of the two main leaders, Matteo Salvini of the Lega and Luigi Di Maio of the M5S. Since they didn't share an enemy, they often fought each other using foreign policy as a domestic weapon.
The France dispute was entirely driven by Di Maio for domestic political reasons.
As M5S polls declined, Di Maio aggressively stoked tensions with France. He called President Macron enemy number one, accused France of colonial policies in Africa, and broke diplomatic taboo by personally traveling to meet the leader of the Yellow Vests movement in France.
That's a stunning intervention in the domestic affairs of a fellow EU member state.
Pure domestic signaling. It was about demonstrating to his working-class voters that M5S stood against the European elites, with Macron serving as the perfect symbol. France responded by recalling its ambassador.
And simultaneously, the migration dispute was Salvini's personalized domain, led by the Interior Ministry.
Salvini increased personalization and mobilization dramatically around migration. He illegally closed ports to NGO rescue ships and used Twitter constantly to attack Europeanist Italian parties and the EU. His hardball style eventually led to the termination of the EU's Operation Sophia mission.
So if an issue was salient enough for either leader to personalize, the policy changed radically and confrontationally.
However, we see the pattern hold on GPG where the issue wasn't salient. Continuity on GPG prevailed. Climate and aid policy showed little change because neither issue was sufficiently high profile for high-level personalization or mobilization by either Salvini or Di Maio. They simply didn't care enough to fundamentally change the bureaucracy.
That is a fascinating synthesis of findings. It clearly shows that populist foreign policy is not a singular monolithic entity. It is a complex reaction. Let's synthesize these takeaways for the listener.
The first key takeaway is really the debunking of that isolationist expectation. Populists do not necessarily stand in the way of international cooperation, particularly those aspiring for greater global status like Turkey and India.
They're not necessarily more egoistic, but they certainly are more selective about where and how they choose to cooperate.
Absolutely. They prioritize multilateral or intergovernmental organizations where they can gain greater visibility and status, like India embracing the G20 presidency. The headline achievement becomes far more important than the difficult, nuanced work of actual policy implementation.
The second synthesis, however, carries a strong note of caution for the rest of the world. It's about the reliability of the populist partner.
It is the long-term strategic risk. The profound personalization of foreign policy renders populist countries less reliable partners. Policy can shift suddenly based on the leader's personal mood, a perceived offense like with Duterte, or an immediate domestic political necessity.
You can no longer rely on the continuity provided by the foreign ministry.
And the longer these populist leaders remain in power, the more permanent their imprint becomes. This goes beyond temporary policy shifts. This is about fundamentally changing the machinery of state.
That's the core finding and the long-term danger.
The longer populists remain in power, the more fundamentally they transform their foreign policy apparatuses and institutional culture. Erdogan, for instance, systematically eliminated the Kemalist establishment's control of Turkish foreign affairs. Orbán moved the EU portfolio directly to his office and overhauled the diplomatic corps.
This transformation ends up mainstreaming even the more obscure elements of their thick ideologies into the state apparatus itself, making the populist imprint structural and potentially lasting long beyond the leader's tenure.
It creates a state that is structurally designed to support the populist worldview. We've seen that the institutional buffers designed to ensure continuity, the foreign ministries, the national security councils, are systematically dismantled or marginalized.
And that leads us to the final provocative thought for you, the learner. Considering this high level of personalization we've observed, From Modi sidelining the MEA, to Erdogan transforming Turkish diplomacy, to Johnson overriding scientific advice on climate based on a single briefing. If the individual leader is the final arbiter of foreign policy, what happens when that leader eventually leaves power?
That's the critical democratic challenge. If the institutional culture is so fundamentally transformed and the thick ideologies are now mainstreamed into the state apparatus itself, do the foreign policy institutions ever truly recover their original consensus-seeking function?
Or is the populist imprint permanent? What does democratic succession look like in a system where only one person ever made the high-stakes decisions? That's the question many of the countries we analyze in this dive will eventually have to answer.